Hello all, and welcome to Let's Read The Case for a Creator by Lee Strobel. This video is looking at Chapter 9, The Evidence of Biological Information, the Challenge of DNA and the Origin of Life. So again, we're looking at the origin of life, or abiogenesis, which has been referenced in several previous chapters. The main focus of this chapter is actually DNA, which is slightly odd, since as far as I can tell, the experts don't actually think that DNA was present when life actually originated. That is, I'm pretty sure that DNA was relatively late development in life, after other simpler forms of life. But anyway, the first section is a brief overview of DNA, with quotes from intelligent design advocate Michael Denton, and from the PBS documentary Unlocking the Mystery of Life. The section concludes with this quote regarding the human genome. President Clinton said scientists were learning the language in which God created life, while geneticist Francis S. Collins, head of the Human Genome Project, said DNA was our instruction book, previously known only to God. Are such public bows to a creator merely a polite social custom, meant only as a nodding courtesy to a predominantly theistic country? Or does the bounty of information in DNA really warrant the conclusion that an intelligent designer must have infused genetic material with its protein-building instructions? I mean, a third option would be that both President Clinton and Francis Collins are Christians and personally believe what they said. I mean, that doesn't change the fact that the majority of qualified scientists do not see DNA as evidence of intelligent design, or that most people who do think that it's evidence for a creator believe that on non-scientific reasons. Anyway, Strobel's lack of interest in these later chapters of the book continues, with only one short introductory section before getting into the interview. This chapter, Strobel interviews Stephen Meyer, who we met previously in Chapter 4. By the time of this interview, apparently, Meyer has left academia to take up a post at the Discovery Institute, which Strobel's footnote describes as a think tank that deals with a wide variety of projects in the fields of technology, science and culture, legal reform, national defence, the environment and the economy, the future of democratic institutions, transportation, religion and public life, foreign affairs, and other areas. This is a blatant misrepresentation of what the Discovery Institute does. The vast bulk of activity that they undertake is simply the promotion of intelligent design. That is it. Overwhelmingly, that's basically almost all that it does. They have some minor projects in transportation in the Pacific Northwest of the US, and they have some blogs promoting democracy in Russia. Overwhelmingly though, the time, effort and money of the Discovery Institute is spent on promoting religion via intelligent design, and to suggest otherwise is simply wrong. Anyway, the rest of this section is the standard biography of Meyer, complete with everything he's ever written. Something I found interesting is that Strobel mentions a debate that Meyer had with an atheistic anthropologist, by which I assume he means an anthropologist who happened to be an atheist. There's no mention, though, of who that person is, when or where the debate was. And so despite Strobel's claims that Meyer clearly won the debate, I kind of would like to see it myself to see if I agree, but there's no actual information in the book and I couldn't find out where it was. The section ends with this. Even though most Darwinists concede they are stumped on the question of how DNA and life itself came to existence, they don't like Meyer's conclusion on the matter. Again, I'm sure he actually means scientists who accept evolution rather than Darwinists. Also, the scientific community is not stumped. They just don't have an answer yet. Stumped implies that they've got no idea even where to begin, but that's not the case. Lastly, even if this was the case, it's still reasonable to reject intelligent design, even if you don't have a better explanation. I mean, it's not like we should accept a wrong answer simply because we don't have the right answer yet. I mean, the reasonable position to take is that we don't know. The next section is Meyer explaining the argument for intelligent design based on the existence of DNA. The basic idea is that DNA contains biological information, and the presence of this information needs to be accounted for. Meyer explains it like this. When I ask students what they would need to get their computer to perform a new function, they reply, you have to give it new lines of code. The same principle is true in living organisms. All this reveals is a paucity of imagination in Meyer and his students. I mean, there are other ways that a computer or a living organism can gain a new function. I mean, most obviously through evolution. I mean, genetic algorithms run on computers and can produce new functionality in a computer without anyone giving it a single new line of code. I mean, similarly, unless you deny evolution in its entirety, which even, the most ardent creationists don't usually do, you have to accept that evolution by natural selection does allow organisms to gain new functions. Anyway, in keeping with Strobel's habits of having his experts state the conclusion of their arguments repeatedly in the hope that simple repetition will convince us, Meyer says, I mean that the origin of information in DNA, which is necessary for life to begin, is best explained by an intelligent cause rather than any of the types of naturalistic causes that scientists typically use to explain biological phenomena. This fails for two reasons. It hasn't been established that DNA is actually necessary for life. Some believe that life began with DNA, but most qualified scientists believe in pre-DNA life, I mean particularly RNA-based life. Now these questions aren't actually settled, and there's much research to be done, but it seems likely that DNA isn't entirely necessary for life. Also, intelligent design is not the best explanation because it's not even an explanation. One should only reason to good explanations, not simply the best explanation. The best of a bad lot is a bad explanation. I mean, even if he's right that all current naturalistic explanations are lacking, intelligent design is also lacking. So the most reasonable course is to withhold judgment and simply admit we don't know. I mean, to do otherwise is to make an argument from ignorance. Meyer spends the rest of this section explaining protein synthesis from DNA, using some beads. And the basic points that he wants to make are that proteins are incredibly complex 3D molecules, and that all of this complexity comes from information stored in DNA. Now, while it's a simplistic metaphor, using the beads, and people with a decent understanding of the science will probably disagree with the characterization, I don't really have any substantive objections to make, so I'll simply move on to the next section. The next section is Meyer continuing his explanation that DNA is complex and information carrying, likening the DNA within a cell to a library for building proteins. I mean, he explains that the sheer amount of information in DNA, which he says is between 1200 to 2000 bases for each protein, which Strobel comments raises the question of where all this information came from. Meyer's response is, this issue has caused all naturalistic accounts of the origin of life to break down because it's the critical and foundational question. If you can't explain where the information comes from, you haven't explained life, because it's the information that makes the molecules into something that actually functions. To which I say, so what? Sure, a complete account of the origin of life would need to explain how DNA came to be. But even if we never manage that, it lends no weight to the claims of intelligent design. I mean, this is the same old stupid argument from ignorance that Strobel's experts are now trotting out, it seems like, every couple of pages. Meyer quotes Bill Gates in support of the idea that DNA is like a computer program, which is stupid because Gates is hardly qualified to comment on biology and is likely, as a computer programmer himself, to see computer programs everywhere he looks. Anyway, Meyer then goes on to finally lay out his argument for intelligent design. Even the very simplest cell we study today, or find evidence of in the fossil record, requires information that is stored in DNA or some other information carrier. And we know from our experience that information is habitually associated with conscious activity. Using uniformitarian logic, we can reconstruct the cause of that ancient information in the first cell as being the product of intelligence. Now, Meyer dresses up with this term uniformitarian logic, but all it is an argument by analogy. And it's an analogy that I addressed last chapter and in most of the chapters prior to that. I mean, briefly, there are no objective measures of information, i.e. what is information and what isn't, that would actually allow us to infer design. I mean, there are a lot of complex things in nature that are not the result of intelligence. And it's not clear that DNA is closer to say, library books than it is to, say, the arrangement of stars in the sky. I mean, the constellations in the sky could encode vast amounts of information, but nobody suggests that they are intelligently designed. Well, that's a brief overview because I can't be bothered going through it all over again. This next section is Meyer arguing against the idea of a primordial soup. The primordial soup is the idea that life on Earth began in what Darwin called some warm little pond, containing the necessary chemicals. Meyer rightly points out that many experts argue that this isn't actually a likely scenario, as such a soup of chemicals may never have actually existed in sufficient quantities in our planet's history. We've subsequently found that out since Darwin's time. He then goes on to attack the Miller-Urey experiment, which we saw in, I think, chapter 3, and levelling essentially the same wrong criticisms of it. And I don't really have much to say in response to this section because it actually does very little to advance Meyer's argument. I mean, at best, it establishes that a particular hypothesis about one step in abiogenesis was wrong. I mean, there are currently many competing hypotheses regarding abiogenesis, and that one of them, from the 1800s, has turned out to be wrong is not really an indictment of the science. Strobel concludes the section with this. Still, is there any reasonable naturalistic route to life? Like a homicide detective rounding up the usual suspects, I decided to run down the 3 possible scenarios to see if any of them made sense. It seems to me it's almost a Freudian slip for him to liken himself to some lazy police officer who can't be bothered actually investigating and simply arrests people based on some criminal history. And to go from this idea of any naturalistic explanation to simply looking at 3 scenarios hardly does justice to the dozens of explanations that scientists are currently considering. This section is just Meyer beating up a straw man. No one seriously thinks that life arose simply by a chance combination of chemicals, so this is just Strobel avoiding consideration of the hypotheses that actually are taken seriously. In the next section, Meyer argues that the idea of natural selection, he argues against the idea of natural selection playing a role in abiogenesis. I mean, the idea here is that natural selection, or a process that is substantially similar to that, could have played a role in building complexity into pre-biological molecules. That is, if large, non-living chemical molecules could be shown to, say, reproduce, compete, change their function, and pass on such changes, then a kind of natural selection could take place in a pre-life world. Meyer's arguments against this idea are simply stupid. His first objection is that to have reproduction, there has to be cell division, which means that you need to have a cell. And this is simply not true. And is actually the point in dispute here. The idea of pre-biological natural selection is that such a process could possibly take place. And simply asserting that it can't is not an argument. Oh, and he manages to slip in a sneaky, whether natural selection really works at the level of biological evolution is open to debate. Which is funny, because the only people I can come across who are actually debating it are apologists, not scientists. Meyer's next objection is that the idea of pre-biological natural selection couldn't work, because the idea that it occurred with RNA is disputed. This is just a non sequitur. Even if the so-called RNA hypothesis, world hypothesis is wrong, that just shows that one particular model for a pre-biological natural selection process is wrong. And despite there being many criticisms of the idea of an RNA world, most qualified scientists think it's likely. Now, my favourite part of this chapter is when Strobel quotes Gerald Joyce to argue that RNA couldn't have been the first form of life. This quote came from 1989, when Joyce was painting out the many, many gaps in the RNA world hypothesis at the time. So in 1989, this idea that, there could have been life or maybe pre-biological, whatever, based entirely on RNA, not DNA, was a very open hypothesis without a lot of evidence to back it up. The funny thing is, 20 years later, in 2009, which admittedly is 5 years after this book was published, Joyce's lab, the same guy that he's quoted, produced a system of RNA enzymes that were capable of sustained reproduction and evolution. I mean, that is, they artificially in the lab produced an RNA world, which is exactly what Meyer and Strobel are arguing against. So this is my favourite part, the irony that they're quoting a guy who was saying that basically back in 1989, the RNA world hypothesis was, didn't have really any evidentiary support. 20 years later, just 5 years after this book, managed to prove that essentially it was quite a plausible thing. So the third option that Strobel wants to consider is the idea that DNA might simply be self-assembled in a process perhaps akin to snowflake formation. That is, that the incredibly complex molecular structures of DNA simply come together as a result of the underlying chemistry of the molecules. Again, this is just a straw man for Meyer to beat up. No one seriously proposes that the vast complexity of biochemistry can be explicated through simple chemical laws. It's been argued that certain aspects of biochemistry may be explained this way, but not the entirety of DNA. Still, it's easier to argue against a straw man, so Strobel actually devotes twice as much space to that scenario as he did to the previous one. The next section is Meyer arguing for intelligent design. So he's knocked out, he feels like he's knocked down all the naturalistic explanations, now he wants to argue for intelligent design. So he starts by concluding that there are no naturalistic explanations for origin of life because he's managed to knock down, a couple of straw men. And he starts it off with this quote from Francis Crick. "An honest man, armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have had to be satisfied to get it going." And I agree with this quote. I actually think it expresses it perfectly well. The thing that Strobel misses is it's all qualified by the knowledge that we have now, and it would appear at the moment. And the problem for Strobel is that quote is from 1981. I mean, in the 23 years between Crick making that quote and this book being published, the apparent miracle has become somewhat less miraculous, and in the 10 years since then, even more so. And this quote really doesn't say much, other than that the origin of life is beyond our current understanding. I mean, it doesn't even support the idea that it's beyond naturalistic explanation, simply that we haven't got there yet. The remainder of this section is Meyer arguing that information comes from intelligence. That is, whenever we find information, we can reliably infer that it was created by an intelligence. Quote, "The coding regions of DNA have exactly the same relevant properties as a computer code or language. As I said earlier, whenever you find a sequential arrangement that's complex and corresponds to an independent pattern or functional requirement, this kind of information is always the product of intelligence. Books, computer codes, and DNA all have these two properties. We know books and computer codes are designed by intelligence, and the presence of this type of information in DNA also implies an intelligent source." The problem here is that DNA doesn't correspond to an independent pattern or functional requirement. Meyer gets this backwards. DNA is not designed to produce proteins that are necessary for cells to function. Instead, cells come to rely on these proteins, making the DNA a functional requirement. I mean, Meyer wants to see this as a process whereby an intelligent designer looks at a cell and says, we need a protein to help out this reaction. And so then he codes a piece of DNA to produce the required protein. But we know that evolution can produce DNA that appears to correspond to some functional requirement without any intelligence required. I mean, last chapter, we saw from Barry Hall's experiment that a bacteria re-evolved a function that had been artificially removed, acquiring a new gene to perform the old function. I mean, that DNA that was seen to absorb, that DNA meets Meyer's criteria of complexity and apparently corresponding to a functional requirement, but it was, observed to evolve in a lab. No intelligence required. But this chapter is supposed to be about the origin of life, and so perhaps Meyer is arguing that DNA itself, not just the portions of it that appear to correspond to a particular protein, DNA itself must be the product of intelligence. I mean, the problem with that, though, is that he's advanced no arguments or evidence for it, and his own analogy even argues against it. So let's consider his analogy between books and DNA. I mean, the problem with this analogy is he's sort of suggesting that DNA, that is the actual system, the chemical system of DNA for storing information for protein production, amongst other things, is similar to books. But this is wrong. The analogy should be that DNA is analogous to writing, and that an individual genome, so a particular piece of DNA, is analogous to a book. Once you see the distinction, it becomes clear that while you might make an argument that since a particular book, Strobel's book, allegedly, was intelligently designed, that therefore, a particular, say, bacteria, its genome might have been intelligently designed. I mean, I think that's a poor argument, but you could mount that one based on his analogy. But you can't mount that same argument for DNA itself, that is the system whereby information is encoded. I mean, we know that languages, and written languages as well, have evolved through usage and without much intelligent intervention. I mean, we know that the overwhelming amount of, most spoken and written languages were not created by people sitting down and going, well, how should we design this language? I mean, the letters we use, the grammar, the vocabulary, the meanings of words, these are not intelligently designed. I mean, these features largely are evolved with the most useful aspects of it, being retained. And so this analogy between language and, natural language or human language and DNA is not an argument for intelligent design. Strobel and Meyer spend the next 2 pages arguing that the Cambrian explosion is powerful evidence of a designer. This is only vaguely related to his argument from DNA. Essentially, Meyer claims that since there was a relatively rapid increase in biological diversity during Cambrian era, this must have entailed a rapid increase in the diversity of DNA, or the amount of information in DNA. and hence there needs to be some kind of explanation for the apparent explosion in biological information. The problem for Meyer is that the Cambrian explosion wasn't so rapid as to defy naturalistic explanations. I mean, the rate of evolution during the Cambrian explosion was probably not significantly higher than at other times. Also, there have been at least 2 other similarly rapid increases in biological diversity, firstly with land plants and then again with flowering plants. There is still a lot of debate about the precise causes and mechanisms of the Cambrian explosion, but it's essentially settled that it is precisely what we would have expected to see when life evolves in an environment with very low selection pressure. In the next section, Meyer continues his argument that the Cambrian explosion presents a problem for evolution. So the start of the section consists of him cherry-picking data so as to make the Cambrian explosion seem even more rapid. For example, he claims that it was only 5 million years long, but actual estimates are that it's between 70 and 80 million years long, so more than 10 times longer than he wants to claim. He insinuates that all phyla of life appeared during the Cambrian explosion, but many phyla did not, and much of the diversification of life actually came after the Cambrian. He claims that Precambrian life consisted of nothing more complex than sponges, worms, or mollusks, but much of the complexity attributed to the Cambrian explosion is no more complex than a worm or a mollusk. I mean, in fact, worms are described as being of medium complexity, not the primitive life forms that Meyer wants us to envisage when he's talking about the Cambrian explosion. Anyway, he then goes on to actually argue that this diversity is related to DNA, saying, "Only mutations in the earliest development of organisms have a realistic chance of producing large-scale macroevolutionary change. And scientists have found that mutations at this stage typically have disastrous effects. The embryo usually dies or is crippled. The kind of mutations that macroevolution needs, namely large-scale beneficial ones, don't occur, while the kind that it doesn't need, large-scale mutations with harmful effects or small-scale mutations with limited impact, do occur, though infrequently." So the first claim here is a non sequitur. Meyer claims that such mutations typically have disastrous effects, but he wants us to hear always have disastrous effects. Sorry, but even if most mutations were disastrous, that would hardly prevent evolution from occurring. The second claim he makes is wrong on 2 counts. Macroevolution does not rely on sudden, large-scale changes, but is generally the cumulative result of many small-scale changes. But even if this weren't true, the research has shown precisely the kind of large-scale, beneficial mutations that Meyer claims doesn't occur. In particular, it's been found that small changes to Hox genes during development can lead to radically different body plan. And it's been hypothesized that that is part of actually what happened during the Cambrian explosion. Meyer finishes this section by claiming that natural selection won't preserve non-beneficial mutations, which is wrong, as I've explained in previous chapters, and then concludes that intelligent design must have done it. The next section is Meyer explaining how intelligent design explains the Cambrian explosion. Now, I've covered this in previous chapters, so briefly, the problem here is that although intelligent design fits the data, it doesn't make any useful predictions. I mean, essentially, it's easy to come up with a hypothesis that fits whatever data you happen to have. I mean, the hypothesis that things just happen to be the way they are fits the data perfectly well, but it fails to have any predictive power, and intelligent design fails for the same reason. The key point that Meyer makes in this section is that major modifications appeared early in the Cambrian explosion, with minor modifications later. Meyer sees this as evidence against evolution, but this is hardly incompatible with natural selection. I mean, if the early Cambrian was an environment with low selection pressure due to organisms opening up new biological niches, then rapid evolution and lots of diversity is exactly what we would expect to see. As these niches are filled, selection pressure increases, and we see a refinement of the forms occurring. Anyway, the other interesting part is at the end of the section, where Strobel accuses intelligent design of being an outmoded concept from more than 200 years ago. Meyer actually gets quite cross at this and says that evolutionists are still trying to apply Darwin's 19th century thinking to a 21st century reality, which I found quite funny. No one's actually clinging to Darwinism, which is why it bothers me when Strobel uses that label for people who actually accept modern evolutionary theory. Scientists have kept what works. They've thrown out what doesn't work and what's wrong, and they've honed their theory through experimentation and observation. I mean, sure, many of Darwin's key concepts are still there, but that's because they've stood up to testing. The fact that the same objections to Paley's watchmaker argument from 200 years ago, the same objections still apply to intelligent design arguments made today, shows that design arguments haven't updated their arguments anywhere near as much as scientists have updated their theory of evolution. The last section of this chapter opens with one of my favourite quotes. "Fast forward 10 or 20 years, I said, what do you see? I think the information revolution taking place in biology is sounding the death knell for Darwinism and chemical evolutionary theories." Well, 10 years after that quote, and intelligent design is on the wane. Evolutionary theory is stronger than ever, and our understanding of abiogenesis improves monthly. Meyer then sums up his argument with this. Information is the hallmark of mind, and purely from the evidence of genetics and biology, we can infer the existence of a mind that's far greater than our own. A conscious, purposeful, rational, intelligent designer who's amazingly creative. There's no getting around it. This is the only argument that Meyer has actually made this chapter, although he has repeatedly asserted it. And again, it's simply a dodgy argument by analogy. Our minds produce information, therefore anything that seems like information to us must have come from a mind. And the thing that disappoints me most about this chapter is that it wasn't just wrong, but also badly argued. I mean, Meyer kept slipping between talking about abiogenesis and evolution, and these aren't the same, and he didn't even do a good job of equivocating between the two of them. I mean, there's a much better question that Meyer should have posed. He should have asked, where did the first piece of biological information come from? I mean, even if it wasn't DNA, but RNA or something else. What did the very first piece of information represent? I mean, the progression from pre-DNA life to DNA life is probably a much more stark contrast than what he's presented in this chapter, and I think a harder question to answer. I mean, it would still just be an argument from ignorance, but at least it would be more intelligently put together. Anyway, Strobel's running out of enthusiasm, as am I, but we've only got one real chapter to go before there's a sort of a conclusion and an appendix. So, join me next time for chapter 10, The Evidence of Consciousness, the Enigma of the Mind.